Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Nicci Chats 2. This is a weekly podcast that I do where I interview various people who have interesting insights to share, with the main idea of changing perspectives and giving you different ideas and different ways of seeing the world so that we can all become better people and a better society. So I'm very excited today to have my friend Silvia Scozia with me. Silvia is one of the founding partners of BST Impact. She's the head of law and policy, and their primary objective is helping businesses have a meaning and positive impact through the development of strong sustainability strategies. So she does a lot of work with people around their sustainability goals, around human rights, and she's very committed to uplifting the environment and the people within the environment, particularly from a human rights perspective. Silvia, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to join.
So today, Silvia and I are going to be chatting about human rights. So firstly, because this is an area of expertise for her, but also because I just felt that with everything that's going on at the moment, while we're not specifically going to focus on any particular area, this is a very pertinent issue. And I think there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of misunderstanding and misalignment and misused words around this issue. And that's also something that I would like to clarify for myself, and I'm sure a lot of you would also like to get a better understanding around these things. So, Silvia, let's jump straight in. And I'm going to ask you a question which might sound almost stupidly simple, but it's something that I've been grappling with over the past few weeks and months. What does the term human rights, what does it actually mean when we use these words? Because we throw them around and it's my right and I'm entitled and, you know, human rights are being violated. But what does this term actually mean?
Yes. So to start from the basics, as you're saying, and from the definition of human rights, we just unpack the word. And it's the right that we all have for the simple fact of being human, for being human beings. We all have rights that can be freedom from something or freedom to something. So in this sense, they are entitlements. I have the right to go to school, to receive medical health care. And I have the freedom from violence, from torture, from inhuman treatment. So these are the two dimensions. And to say that human rights are intrinsic of all human beings, it means that it is basically something that grants us all choice. So the choice to participate in the life of our community, for example, because we have shelter, because we have food, because we are healthy, because we have the right to property, because we have all of these things that we give for granted sometimes in our lives. And it is something that is inalienable, so cannot be taken away. That is indivisible, meaning that all rights have the same importance, and they all have equal importance.
Okay.
And it is they are interconnected. So that means that the enjoyment of one right will be connected with the enjoyment of the others. They cannot be seen as isolated things, because if you think about having food on the table will allow you to have, so the right to food will allow you to have a healthy condition. So will grant you, in a sense, your health. And the fact that you are the object of medical health care will allow you to be enforced to perform your work tasks, and so to be participating in the labor market. And so the right to food, the right to health, the right to work, they're all interconnected, because our lives are all, they all have these dimensions, right? We all need all these things to perform as human beings. And the fact that, you know, they are so important to us all, sometimes it's it's in a way overseen by those that, like us, are more privileged because they enjoy them. They have not fought for them in the first line, because there have already been they already have been negotiated, and states have already taken up obligations to observe and to respect. There's a division of responsibilities. If you want, then we can talk about that. But to take the responsibility to create the conditions for all citizens, in this case, to enjoy their human rights.
Okay, that's it's quite in depth. It's a lot more in depth than what I initially imagined. So then, who is responsible for managing these? Is it individual countries? I mean, as you know, I'm South African, and we have a very interesting and complicated history of human rights violations. And we have moved to an area or a country now where we always claim to have one of the best constitutions in the world that protects different kinds of human rights and protects people of color, people of different religions, different sexual orientations. I mean, whether it works in implementation is a separate discussion. But who becomes responsible? Is it the UN? Who governs this?
So from a legal perspective, there are obligations that are upon states. So human rights law is a branch of public international law. That means that the duty bearers, so the ones that are responsible to implement these obligations, are states. And this is because human rights was born to protect individuals against disproportionate power. So the states exercise a disproportionate power over the single individual. And there is this set of rules that protects and allows the individual to have certain standards to be upheld by the state. So the responsibility is of the state, the national authority, that has ratified instruments, legal instruments, binding conventions that set forth certain obligations that they have to implement, so incorporate in their national system. So there is a mechanism at the UN level that oversees this implementation. And there are processes that review how states have been incorporating in their national legislation these obligations. So states first commit to something, then they are responsible for translating those commitments into their national rules, so laws, policies, etc. And then they have to report back to the UN treaty bodies, it's called, because it's the bodies that oversee the implementation of the human rights treaties of the UN. So this is the mechanism that allows a sort of oversight at the international level of the state's implementation of their international obligations.
Okay, so that's at a state level, that would be the intersection of human rights and obligations. When you break that down to me as an individual, as a business owner, as a leader, as a whatever in my community, where do human rights and my obligations intersect more sort of at an individual, or I don't want to quite, even if it's not as deep as individual, but possibly even a company level. So that smaller level.
Yeah, because this concept of the state being the only duty bearer has been overcome in a way that, in the sense that a broader perspective is now taken and adopted whenever there is somebody, it can be a legal entity or a physical person, that is exercising a disproportionate power over somebody else. And in that case, the responsibilities arise, as well as the state, as we were talking before, has responsibilities that are to respect people's rights, so not interfere with their rights, to protect them from the interference of somebody else, and to create the conditions to fulfill the enjoyment of rights. This can be translated also to businesses, as you were saying, where there is an incredibly powerful influence that businesses can have on the enjoyment of rights of their employees, of the communities where they operate. And there are actions that businesses can take to make sure that the impact on the enjoyment of rights is taken into consideration throughout all phases of their operation. So there is a rights lens that is applied since the project planning through the implementation to the monitoring and evaluation. And this needs to be done, talking about businesses and the processes they need to have in place to make sure that this is always kept in mind, not only when designing an operation, but also when doing the M&E, when actually seeing which kind of impact as the operation produced, as it hampered human rights, as it promoted human rights, what are the numbers and what can be improved. And so this needs always to be done with the principles of participation in mind. So how have I engaged the stakeholders, the communities, the employees in shaping my policies, my strategy, and in measuring the impact that I've had on their lives. And non-discrimination, which is always a principle that applies to everything. So treating people in equal situation equally. And accountability. So creating the mechanisms so that when a violation of human rights has occurred, because it can happen even with the best policies in place, then you have an action plan to provide remedies. And in that case, you are taking action to protect human rights. You're taking action to make sure that the person that has been harmed has access to an adequate compensation. That can be adequate remedy, can be compensation, it can be restitution, etc. So from a business perspective, there are processes, mechanisms, actions that can be taken that have a direct impact on human rights and contribute to the protection of human rights. From an individual, I think it depends on the influence that you think you can have in your various dimensions of your private and professional life. If we talk about, generally speaking, the responsibilities that individuals have towards others for the enjoyment of rights, it's always a delicate balance between, my freedom ends when yours begins. So it's always the responsibility. So you have the right to enjoy your freedom of expression, of thought, etc. But you need to make sure that it doesn't harm other people's rights, reputation, freedom, etc. So this is the balance that as individuals we are called to assess when exercising our rights. And it's also the rationale behind the legal framework that regulates these behaviors.
Okay, so if I look at something like the Sustainability Development Goals, and I know those are a series of goals as opposed to rights, in my mind, there's definitely a very strong overlay between basic human rights and alignment with the sustainability goals. Things like access to decent work, gender equality, no poverty. So it's kind of almost like the SDGs have been overlaid with human rights and gone, right, how can we extrapolate these and turn them into implementation goals that people need to follow?
Exactly. Yes, and they are based on human rights. It's there's a clear connection. You're absolutely right. And as human rights, they are interconnected. So it's very difficult that there is no overlap or no spillover effect of one area on the other. And one can help also furthering and promoting the other. So absolutely, this is because it's all been thought in the same international framework that has developed the human rights law framework with the human rights treaties. So if you look at what now regulators are looking at to measure a company's sustainability performance in terms of human rights. All the standards, they are not made up from one day to the other. They all refer back to the treaties, because it's a work that has already been done. All the outputs have already been negotiated. And so it's something that now, especially when we talk about the final texts of the conventions, is something that is usually not controversial. So usually what has already been, what states have already committed to, and so the most universally, the universally ratified treaties, or the treaties that are mostly ratified by the majority of states, those are standards that now are safe to take as a benchmark and to transpose them also for companies, in order also to allow then states, when they have to transpose this in their national legislation, to not have particular difficulties, because they have an harmonized framework of reference, and they can then adapt them to their national legal system or context.
Okay. So it's this framework that exists, that's based on various treaties that have happened, that have been translated into a series of rights that have become the framework that forms the basis for how we should govern ourselves and how we should contextually operate within our lives, just to kind of very, very simplify.
Yes, no, you're right. What is strange when we talk about this is that we're talking about individuals, and now we self-regulate. And on the other hand, we're talking about international law that is public law. So it talks about authorities and institutions, etc. So, but you're right, it's international treaties, then national legislation. Usually it's the Constitution. The Constitution enshrines what the rights of citizens. And then those are the guarantees that we have as individuals in our daily life. Then I don't know if you were asking for what we can do as individuals to protect.
I think that's definitely something that I'm going to get to, but I just want to dig into something a little bit deeper that you mentioned about individual responsibility, and it's a topic that comes up very regularly here in South Africa, and I know certainly in other countries as well. This linkage between my rights, freedom of speech, and hate speech. Right. And how all of those fit in, because on the one hand, yes, I do have this right to say whatever I want because I have freedom of speech. But if that is inciting violence, or when does it become hate speech? What is? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, this is a very interesting topic, because it's, as you say, it's always a very delicate balance, and it's always quite dangerous to interfere with this right, because freedom of expression is there to guarantee also a democratic oversight of what the authorities, for example, are doing, and you must be free to discuss it publicly and to express your opinion. And it's also something that allows cultural exchanges of ideas, and it grants you the right to seek information. It can give also voice to marginalized people or groups. That can have their voice heard, because they have the freedom to express their views. On the other hand, it is not a right that cannot be limited. It is protected, but it doesn't mean that there are certain manifestations that cannot be prohibited by law. So. And this is specifically what you were saying. So if I use my freedom of expression to incite hatred, so promote violence, foster discrimination against a specific group of people, so if it's directed against a community or an individual because it's part of that community, then we're talking about hate speech. So hate speech is when an expression and a behavior is directed, has the aim to incite violence, discrimination, or generally harm.
Yes.
Okay. To incite, so hatred per se. So these three types, it's not exhaustive, but generally is either discrimination or violence or harm to a specific group of people. So it needs to be directed towards somebody or a community that has some protected characteristics. And characteristics can be race, can be nationality, ethnicity, can be gender, can be administrative status. For example, there was a big problem with hate speech against irregular migrants. And that is prohibited by law under international law, and can also actually become a crime. So hate speech can turn into hate crime because it stems from incitement to violence. It stems from discrimination that leads to this incitement to harm, to produce harm to a group of people or to an individual, and can lead to an actual crime. So whenever a criminal behavior is committed with the motive of the bias, that's hate crime.
Hate crime.
So
okay.
If you damage my property because I'm a woman, and you do it on the basis of that bias, it's a hate crime. If you threaten me because of one protected characteristic, and if it's a criminal behavior per se, if the threat constitutes criminal behavior per se, so it's already criminalized, right?
Yes.
If it's already criminalized, but the motive is bias, it's prejudice against me because of my inherent characteristic, then it can be a hate crime. And it can also obviously become something more serious like murder, but on the basis of racial bias. So this is where the limits go. They're obviously very interconnected. And as I was saying, it is very important to guarantee freedom of expression on one hand. On the other hand, you cannot use not only this right, but you cannot use any of the rights that we all have guaranteed to harm other people's rights. And this is something that is not protected. It's not me saying, it's protected by the international law instruments.
So that's where you were talking about that overlap between, between our two rights. So I have a set of rights and you have a set of rights, and they're going to overlap at some point. And if my implementation or enforcement of my rights affects you, then it's no longer my right, basically.
Yes, I mean, it depends on the situation because there's different contexts where parts of these assessments have more or less importance. So if we talk about political speech, for example, it's very protected because it's very important that there is variety of points of view in the political discussion. So there, to interfere with the political message of a politician or a message spread by a journalist that is doing his job or a job, it's very difficult to justify legally this interference, this limitation, than somebody who is just inciting to war, for example. There's propaganda for war against a certain ethnic minority, for example. And that's not protected because it's the different situation in terms of subject and in terms of person. So a journalist or a politician would be more protected, would have more freedom because the debate is conducive to an exchange of ideas. This is the rationale a little bit. So when freedom of expression is promoting a democratic debate, it has value, but when it's only directed against a group of people to incite hatred without any value on the other side, when it's gratuitous offenses that are directed to causing harm to that person, and there is no real value for the rest of the community on that particular piece of information or opinion, then it has less importance in this balance.
Okay, so that would also be the balance between, I almost want to say, being provocative and blatant hate speech. So
Exactly.
sharing something that might be very provoking, but it's actually in the interest of the greater good and getting people to stop and think, or, as you said, encourage that debate and that response, as opposed to just the blatant outright hate
Offense
speech.
to religion, for example. Yes.
It's very interesting, because the more you're speaking, the more I'm realizing I'm probably going to need to do another follow-up session just to get more, because this is so, it's very subtle and it's very nuanced. And this is one of those things that I'm sure in certain instances it might be very black and white, but in general, this is not an issue that is black and white. This is very much operating in that gray space in between, and requires an understanding context, requires an understanding of where things intersect, of interconnectedness, how one thing might impact another. So it's quite a complicated system that you're talking about here.
Yes, and even if you look at the jurisprudence and how this has been interpreted by the courts, it changes depending on the situation, on the subject, on the protected characteristic. So there's the assessment is never a black or white situation. What is always used is a sort of step-by-step verification process to check whether the interference with the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, was from a legal point of view okay. So there is they look at whether the limitation was prescribed by law, whether there was a law that said you cannot do this, you can do this up until this point, but they look at whether the aim of this law is legitimate. So it's done to protect somebody else's right or reputation, or morals, or public health, or national security. So these are all legitimate aims. And then it looks at whether the action that has been taken to limit that right was necessary. So there was no other possible way of censoring, of limiting that person from speaking. And whether it was proportionate. Whether it's the least degree of interference, or it's proportionate to the harm that it's causing to the person. So these are the steps that are taken from a legal perspective to see whether this interference is allowed in a way, compliant.
Okay, very interesting.
But it's very difficult.
So would a good example of this, and please correct me if my understanding of the situation is not quite correct, would a good example be, for instance, the steps that they've taken in Germany around banning Holocaust denialism and banning certain symbols that related to that, banning certain language or certain concepts and ideas around that to protect individuals? Would that be a good example?
Yes, this is a very important example on which I know there is an answer. I don't have that answer. I'm not entirely sure about whether my answer is correct, but I know it's definitely something that has been addressed in human rights law. It's something that has been, there is jurisprudence on this, and it's something that has been considered in exactly in the framework of limitation to freedom of expression. And it's in Italy we have something that had been introduced for fascism that was limiting fascism propaganda. And so these are issues that are very present in terms of the state regulation of where does this, at which point does this convert to incitement to discrimination and to hate and to violence? Because obviously these are political ideas that are based on discrimination, on violence, and on hate.
Okay.
So
that's very interesting. I want to just chat a little bit about, because I know this is something that's some area that you've worked in, and it's an issue that has come up here in South Africa as well. So I'm quite interested from our perspective, and this is the issue of human rights, specifically relating to industries like agriculture, and where this does sort of segue into what people can do as individuals, because I think this is one of the areas where we can really become aware and educate ourselves. What has been your experience with this? I know you've worked on some projects around human rights in this area.
Yes, I mean, agriculture is the sector globally, is the sector where most number of workers are trafficked into forced labor. So both victims of human trafficking for working under threat of a menace, of a penalty. And so it's a very high risk sector for these reasons. And surely the main issue that in the agricultural sector in terms of human rights is exploitation, and that is wider than trafficking and forced labor. Perhaps I can make a small clarification around this, because exploitation refers to all working conditions and decent work standards.
Okay.
Whilst human trafficking refers to the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring people through means of deception or fraud for the purposes of exploitation. Whilst forced labor is really the fact of performing labor in an involuntary manner, or under this threat of a penalty. So, for example, when you're not paid and your salary is retained, there are illegal deduction to your salary when your documents are taken and you cannot voluntarily leave your job, etc. So, and this is something that obviously in the agriculture sector it's a prominent issue. And so it really goes from working conditions and health and safety standards that working in agriculture are particularly important, because you can work with hazardous substances or in extreme weather, for example, and there is the issue of child labor that is also quite present, and the fact that sometimes children are involved in the support of the family business, because it's a small family farm, for example, and that sometimes can be okay if so. There are conditions that exclude completely very small children. So before school age, children must not work at all. Exclude completely all hazardous tasks and all tasks that are not that can be prejudicial to their health, to their morals, and to their development. It cannot interfere with schooling. Is another thing. And it has to be age appropriate. So if it's something that it's occasional, that it is appropriate, that doesn't interfere with schooling or leisure, so that doesn't take up all the young worker time, sometimes can be appropriate. But this is a very difficult issue to assess. And also, from our experience in the agricultural sector, is something that really needs a lot of thought, depending on the context, depending on what are the obstacles, what is the situation of every family business, and how you can avoid creating further harm. Sometimes when you think that black or white solutions are the ones that's making your conscience feel more ease, but then you don't look further and you're actually leaving the family in worse conditions than they were before.
Yes.
And yeah, I think I'm going a little bit out of out of topic. Please stop me when I do that.
Because I mean, you don't want to end up in a situation where you have these incredibly stringent laws in place, and it reaches a point where I've got a vegetable patch in my garden, and my 10-year-old niece is not allowed to help me in that vegetable patch because it's considered child labor and against the law. You know,
Yeah, no, exactly.
You can end up in those weird extremes.
No, exactly, and that's why there are considerations that can be made around this. And now, you know, from consumers, sometimes it can be difficult to know where a product comes from.
Yes.
Unless you know that that particular region has a really high risk of child labor, you know, that particular company has a past with and hasn't done anything to adjust the due diligence that they do with in their supply chain. So it is difficult, obviously, to make sure that we always make the best choices and that we're always consuming products that don't come from exploitative supply chains. But I think that people are becoming increasingly more informed. They want to know more. There are regulations in place and other coming that are obliging companies to disclose all this information, so it's easily verifiable. And that can also empower us on one hand and exert pressure on companies to make sure that there are no risks, so that the risks are accounted for, because the risks sometimes are intrinsic. You can also operate in a context where it's a pre-existing condition. It's not you don't arrive in Wonderland. You arrive in a place where you know there's problems and it doesn't all depend from you. There's maybe fragile institutions, and there is something that you need to do proactively because local legislation doesn't help you. So but at least if the company does something to account for these risks, prevent them, and then observe and mitigate them to actually remedy when a harm happens, then as consumers too, I think this is something that we would appreciate.
And I'm definitely seeing more of at a consumer level, more of a move to companies reporting, whether it be through a barcode or how stringent that reporting is, but reporting on their supply chain and looking at, I mean, even going so far as blockchain type technologies to make sure that the supply chain is legit and there aren't environmental or human rights violations. And there are definitely certain, I mean, just from what I've seen, which I wouldn't necessarily say is a very educated space, but there's certain products where the potential violations have been highlighted. You know, I know coffee is a big one, chocolate, that, you know, there are companies that are going, this is free trade chocolate, this is, you know, bean to bar. And there are definitely educating people around their supply chain and going, actually, we are legit. So there are those products that are available out there. So if you can't find any information, just lean towards those products.
It's becoming more and more easy to check. As you say, you know, there's barcodes, so there's also QR codes now.
QR codes, yes.
Are putting that. Then it's also true that there is we need to be able to, well, we can't do that, but we as individuals, but there are, as BSD, for example, we support also with this.
Yes.
So there are ways to actually know whether it's a marketing exercise for the company to say we are ethical from the first step to the last, or whether there is a process in place to verify that suppliers are complying with the code of conduct. For example, they are reporting back. There is a monitoring evaluation process on that. Because there's always the risk that now sustainability is the fashionable thing to say, and sometimes it's just about informing your suppliers that this is what we expect, but then don't have anything to actually check whether the standards are respected. Which I'm not saying it's bad, because it's always that first step. It's still good to have that in place, and to it's a concrete action that you're taking already. But there's always a step farther, right? We can always improve.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's something that I've been looking into quite extensively, is this connection between SDGs, ethics, sustainability, alignment, and brand value. So what value is it? And I mean, I'm not obviously talking about impact and greenwashing, but what is the actual brand value of these things, and how is that impacting how people perceive your brand, whether it's consumer or business focused? Silvia, just to kind of close off, I mean, we're almost getting close to time. This is almost more of a theoretical question, but and I mean, it sounds quite harsh given everything that we've just discussed, but why should I care about the human rights of others beyond just being a decent human being and that sort of thing? What are the bigger implications of violations of, why should I care? When I'm arguing with somebody about hate speech, give me some ammo to use in my argument.
Well, I think, first of all, because it's not others people's rights, it's yours. And right, so we always think that it's happening to somebody else, and that is something that doesn't concern us because it's this particular person or this particular group. But on one hand, this is something that concerns us all, because you may, I'm saying you as an example, obviously I'm talking about you. I know you care. I mean, you may not think that having this conversation is part of our right to information, to freedom of thought, to freedom of expression, being on social media as well, being able to watch the news and have a soup kitchen if we don't have food on the table, can provide it, have shelter if we don't have a roof on our heads, and be able to go to the hospital if you're feeling sick and having medical health care. All these things that we say, yeah, okay, we're privileged, but they are things that affect our single every phase of our daily life, even if we don't think about those. And in terms of why should I care if it's not happening to me right now? I mean, the groups that are targeted by discrimination, they change in history, and it's very unpredictable, and you may never know whether you personally would fall into a category of vulnerability, because vulnerability most of the time, and actually the concept has been evolving, it's not intrinsic, it's a situation. You are a person in a situation of vulnerability. You're not a vulnerable person that was born that way and dies that way. So it can happen to you that something in your life changes. All the migrants that are now undocumented and victims of horrible discriminations, they were not. They were citizens of their countries with their constitutional rights, with their jobs, with their salary and their healthcare and their children going to school and everything. And they've fallen into this category because of something that was out of their control, something that happened to their country. And they have been denied the right to work and all other connected rights because of the lack of a residence permit or an asylum status. Religious hatred also can stem from nothing and can have a very fast, escalation, and you may find yourself victim of that type of discrimination. Something may happen to you in terms of disability, or in terms of just having a very horrible experience on gender violence, for example. So there are things that we are all exposed to, and having guarantees in place that the state recognizes to us and that we recognize to each other is in the interest of all, because it protects us from current and future threats to our rights, to our values, and it also guarantees that society is stable, it's peaceful, it's prosperous. Labor markets are well functioning, are fairer when people can go to school and when people have their right to health respected. If a worker can pay taxes, then it can also participate to the growth of the local community, can participate to political life. It's a value in itself. So I think that's the argument to make. First, it can also be you. So don't think that it cannot concern you. And second, it's a value in itself because it's about having a prosperous and fair society that benefits us all. So, and sometimes, I read something about, which I'm not sure I agree, but it was a strong argument. I read something that said, if when you're arguing with somebody that is racist, okay, and that has a very racist, makes a very racist comment and has a racist point of view, and they said, if this person was ill, would you just abandon them, or would you actually try to take this as if it was to help them? Exactly. So to see that conversation as it was this let's say comparison between discriminatory thought and illness, and so just don't give up because you think it's not worth it. Try to help that person understand. And so besides, I can agree or not, but I think you should pick your battles because we're not superhumans. But I think it's important to engage in those discussions and try to open the person's mind, try to make this points in a very calm way. Without, I know it's difficult.
Sometimes it's difficult to stay calm.
It's so difficult. But then what I realize is that if you don't stay calm and you're just inciting more violence and more tension and more hate in the end, it just you have the opposite reaction, and just there's no ground for coming to an understanding.
Absolutely. There's that expression that says, I don't know if you know it, don't hate your enemy so much that you become them.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you're saying is, if you can't stay calm with the person that you're arguing with, at what point are you going to become them?
Yeah. It's difficult, but I think these conversations are also something that we can do to further the cause. So it also to feel less powerless, because with everything that is happening now in the world, you feel that there is absolutely nothing you can do that will make a concrete difference, and it's not true. There are things that can be done if you know a little bit about what are the main issues, the main needs. Now I'm talking about something else, but I'm talking about Ukraine now, and I didn't want to get there. But no, but I mean, in terms of conversations, I think, and also on behaviors. If you think about your personal sphere, don't think about human rights as being something over there, but think: is there anybody in your family and friends that is currently experiencing discrimination, for example, or having their rights denied because of a particular vulnerability that they are in that moment. Is it a person with disability? Is it a woman that is having a hard time exercising her reproductive rights? Is it a person that belongs to the LGBTI community? And what are you doing? Are you doing everything you can to make that person feel safe, feel protected, feel empowered? Because it's from these small actions that sometimes we don't realize. We have people in our circles and we are either indifferent or judge them or make their life harder instead of being an advocate for everybody's rights in every context. So this is individual to individual.
That's wonderful. And it's such lovely practical, practical advice, because not everybody has your qualifications or the platform but there are things that we can do, as you say, on a very small individual scale. And we are, I mean, the same theme kept coming through over and over again as you were speaking, this notion of interconnectedness. We are all interconnected. So there is no such thing as my rights and your rights. It's actually our rights. And at any time that pendulum can swing, and I could become the person who's at the receiving end of it. So it's important for all of us to contribute. And it is actually for the greater good. So the better off you are as my neighbor, the better off that makes me, because you are a more contributing member to society, as opposed to being an abused, possibly traumatized member of society.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Silvia, do you have any final thoughts?
Any final thoughts? I think I really enjoyed this conversation. I think, it's good to be thinking about these things. It's good to unpack a little bit what it means. And I think that we can all just think about our personal dimension and what we can do if we just think a bit farther and we think about, what's the situation, the violation to human rights that I have experienced, that I've seen somebody else experience recently, or that I've seen in the news, and who is responsible for this, and why is this person or entity failing to protect rights. And so from that understanding, from just this exercise of thinking a bit farther, we can all identify actions, because the actions, the appropriate actions, and the most effective actions will change depending on these factors. And can be as small as we were saying, having a conversation, to join a peaceful protest, to actually create the conditions for the personal network of an individual to influence, or to put in our businesses practices, processes that look at how human rights are impacted. So we can all feel more empowered by this action plans. But it starts from thinking a little bit farther and paying attention to these issues.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. We can all make a difference as individuals, because 1 million individuals is 1 million people, and that's a big difference. Silvia, thank you so much it's been wonderful having you. I've really enjoyed this discussion. You've given me so much to think about. I knew you would. And thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody who's watching this or who joined us live. If you do want to get recordings of these weekly chats, please join my mailing list, and I will email you links to videos and audios that you can listen to if you're not always able to join us. But I will be back next week. I've got a lovely discussion next week about life balance. But Silvia, thank you once again for being here.
Thank you so
take
much.
care, and keep fighting the good fight. But
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Glad. Thanks everybody. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.